everyone. Welcome to this week's Artful Design TV. Good as always to see all of you. While we're waiting just one more minute for everything to kind of settle down Zoom-wise, please feel free to hail and say something on chat, where you're hailing from, how are you doing, and how has this week been for you? So please feel free to chime in.
This is John from home.
Hey, John. Thank you so much for joining us.
And I'm doing well, being very, very careful. At 85, I don't want to end up in a hospital. So there's a lot of motivation to be careful.
That sounds wonderful, John. It's so good to have you here.
And we cook well, eat well, and take care. Both Marina and I take care of one another. We see our family via Zoom, and I'm a grandson who comes by every day or says hello. So we're good.
That's wonderful. Thank you, John. From chat, looks like people are from all over the place, as always. From California to Spain to New York. Yeah, I mean, it feels like time is kind of blurring, right? I mean, I think the term blurs day, I think I've heard that recently. That seems like every day. What day is it? That is a good question. Hi, James. So let's go ahead and get started. As always, feel free to chat. All right, welcome everyone to Artful Design TV, COVID-19 edition, online and in quarantine. As always, you can find us at artful.design/TV. I'm your host, Ge Wang. And for those joining us for the first time, we are a multi-format weekly series encompassing artful design, music, coding, critical making with helpings of history and philosophy and life check-ins. No experience needed, all are welcome, and as always, this is an ongoing experiment that my co-producer and co-organizer Kung-Woo Kim and I are trying along with all of you. So welcome. And today, before we get started, I just want to introduce our special guest, Doga Cavdir, and I'm going to stop sharing so Doa get it, so we can. Hey, Doa, how are you doing? She is there, and
hey,
hello.
Good,
and
thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. And so, as I understand it, you are currently still on campus at Stanford. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm still at Stanford. Not a lot changed here. It's a bit more social than it used to be.
Oh, how so?
I think people are enjoying like outdoors and just hanging out and slowing down a bit.
That's really interesting. So we will come back and we're going to look at 3 instruments in particular that Doa has designed. But before we do that, Doa, tell us a bit more about yourself.
Yeah, I'm Doa. I'm a PhD student at Karma. I do research on new instrument designs, and I'm really interested in how like movement is related to how we express ourselves with music, or how we think about our musical expressions, interactions. So I try to incorporate gestures from musical and non-musical domains, and movement in general, and the instrument design. So that's like what I'm interested in.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us. And I think this idea of movement is actually, speaking of movement, I think this is a good transition for us to do our weekly 30-second group dance. So I'm going to share my screen once more. Those of you who have done this before know how it goes. Those of you who join us for the first time, it's real easy. Basically, we just move in ways that are comfortable to us. So here we go. There's going to be a drop, and when that happens, move. right. So, there's something about just moving together that just feels good. And I think this is actually such an appropriate way for today's topic, which is about instruments and really how movement in the body is incorporated into the design of musical instruments. Um, so thank you all for moving. And before I actually go into the second about thinking about stuff and ask our critical questions of the day, I do have a short story to share with you. Um, and it has to do with, well, kind of what we do, during COVID-19, like kind of what I've been up to. Actually, over the last week, I've been listening more just to music. Like, I don't mean just having it on. I mean just really listen. And this is something that I feel like we don't do as much anymore, right? Like actually just put on music, whether it's like over headphones or over the speaker, and just sit down, lie down, curl up on the floor, whatever you like, and just listen. And this is something that I used to do a lot when I was growing up in Beijing with my grandparents in the 1980s. There's a radio station that twice a week broadcasted Western classical music, which my grandfather loved. And he loved this because back in the 1940s, he actually went to Edinburgh in Scotland to the Rolls-Royce factory to study engine design. And this is during right after World War II. And this is all kind of to help, the war effort. And he saved his money, and on his way back, he brought with him records upon records of classical music, which sadly, some 30 years later, were actually destroyed by Red Guards in the Cultural Revolution. Now, the love of this music never left Grandpa. So, after the Cultural Revolution in the early 80s, he started recording classical music off of the radio. And he did this dutifully, faithfully every week. And over the course of a few years, he compiled a cassette tape library of over 600 cassette tapes, carefully cataloged in these handwritten notebooks that would say, hey, this is, if you want to listen to, Beethoven's fourth movement, that can be found in cassette number 132, side B, and someone would go and retrieve the cassette, put it in the cassette player, rewind, seek to the beginning of the movement. It took a little work, and we all just sat down and listened. We didn't say or necessarily talk about these things after we listened, except to say, that was nice. Listening was enough. And so, in a way, I'm kind of returning to this activity that was so pleasurable that I realized we just don't do much anymore, right? And now it's so easy to access music that it just doesn't. It's easy to forget how special that can be. So anyway, so this week I've been actually going back to listen to all the Beethoven symphonies, the 9, right? And one last piece is as I'm listening, and it's like really listening, I'm doing this in doses, right? I'm not going through the entire 9 symphonies back to back. I'm kind of giving myself time to kind of think about them, to listen to them. And as I was reading the liner notes, actually written by Leonard Bernstein on the 9th, I was reminded actually of another piece, and that is Yellow Submarine by the Beatles. And as preposterous as this comparison might be between Yellow Submarine and, Ode to Joy, at some level, I realized that both pieces are kind of about the same thing. They're about human unity. They're about people coming together. And they're both also born out of a kind of irony, because both of these pieces were written by artists, made by artists, and written during times that were anything other than united. It was written during tumultuous times of upheaval and rather divisive times, which in a way makes me think about art and the role of art as I don't know, something that doesn't even necessarily respond to the times that in which we find ourselves, but tries to acknowledge it, right? And provides a kind of tool for us to process what is happening to us, which brings us back, of course, to the present moment as we're all sheltering in place, entombed, if you will, in our households. So thank you for indulging me in that short story, but I think that's an update from me as to what I've been up to, which is just listening and really listening to music. So with this, let's go to thinking about stuff. And by the way, in chat, please, if you want to, if a similar kind of a anecdote or something that this week that you experienced or started trying, or maybe an old hobby that you're rediscovering, feel free to put that into chat. And I'd love for us all to see kind of what we're take the temperature of what we're up to. And while you're doing that, I'm going to get into kind of today's segment, thinking about stuff. And today we're going to think about new interfaces for musical expression. So there's some of us, perhaps many of us on the episode today who not only see this and recognize it as this is actually a conference, international conference that we submit papers to, go performances to, and we attend every year. That's in NIME, but also it's kind of what we do. We design and think about new interfaces of musical expression. And in particular today, we're going to talk about instrument design. And I think the critical question of the day maybe begins here, is that, what makes for a good instrument? Like, what is a good instrument, right? That may seem like a really broad question, and it is. But since we're talking about design and artful design, I think this is perhaps as good of a place as any to start thinking about this. So this is the second thing we can all put into chat. But while we're doing that, I'm actually going to go to our special guest today, Doa. And well, Doa, like, to you, like, how do you think about this question? Like, what is a good instrument?
Yeah, I think it's a hard question, but I think I start thinking about what is the instrument itself, like who are we designing this instrument for? Is it for the musician or for the dancer, for the audience? Or I think that those are questions that or like, why do I need to design a different instrument, and why can I not use my traditional instruments? So, and that leads me to actually like define what I'm looking for in the instrument, and can argue like what is a good instrument. And for me, I start with thinking about like the gestures and movements and my the physicality of the instrument, how much I can actually express more than what I had already. And yeah, like I think my understanding from the musical performance, it's a little more physical. So that's my starting point. Yeah, I don't know if it's an answer for a good instrument.
I mean, that's a wonderful answer. So would I be far off in distilling that to say what you just said? A good instrument is one that perhaps acknowledges and in some ways expressively take advantage of our bodies and our movements. Would that be?
Yeah, I think so. I think it also, considering all these new instruments, there's a decoupling between the instrument and the interface and the sound itself. So, and I feel a little bit alien playing with an instrument which I can't really connect. So yeah, for me, it is part of the performer's body.
Interesting. And others, everyone here, please feel free to weigh in. I mean, physicality seems to be something that, and also the other part of your answer, Doa, which I thought was quite eloquent, is it really depends on who you're making the instrument for, its context. So I think it's a hard question in general, because I think the answer really does depend on the context in which it's designed, and which includes the people you're designing the instrument for. For example, depending on the context, learnability could be a primary virtue. Does the instrument have a low kind of barrier to entry in terms of learning it for novices? It's on the other end, it's like, what does the same instrument offer a high ceiling in terms of like how good you can get at it? Does it afford a kind of, virtuosic potential that you can achieve with it, right? And so I think these are all things that I think are top of mind when I think instrument designers think about this. But of course, I really like the point that you're making, that it's about context. And I'm seeing a lot of great answers also in chat. For example, a good instrument helps channel the song of the soul. I like that, right? And James, like, I figure a music professor who's always listening to music, I guess as a CS person, I'm rarely programming. That's a really astute observation, right? I mean, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't think I listen to music. I mean, short of going to like a concert, right? And then you sit there and you really get to channel your attention to what is happening. I think the lifestyles right now is just, everything is just so multitasked. Like if I'm working on something, I'm gonna listen to some music, but then in a way, for me, it can be a diminished experience of actually listening to that piece of music. Please continue to add and to contribute to the conversation in chat. And as we now move forward, having taken at least this moment to think about this question. And from here, in terms of instruments and interfaces, well, kind of what's the difference? Well, an interface we might think of as the membrane of interaction between human and technology, right? This is the thing in between. This is how we actually access the technology and to access whatever affordances a thing is actually going to give us. And an instrument, for example, a musical instrument, might be thought of as an interface that then mediates the interaction between a player and some underlying sound-making mechanism, which we might call the technology. So readers of Artful Design might remember that actually one of the longer chapters in the book, Chapter 5, is all about interface design, followed by an interlude with Perry Cook, who we was both on the episode 2 of Artful Design TV, and he was also here last week talking about Chuck. And so much of this actually, draws from a lot of things that I've learned from Perry. One of them is something that, we as instrument designers think about a lot, and is that interaction is not a one-way street, right? It's a complex set of cycles. For example, in playing a ukulele, we might think about, what do I want to play? That might be your intention. So you think about it, that translates into action, motor control, physical gestures, and you're doing something, right? You're fingering the strings and you're plucking it. For example, there's a haptic dimension, and then of course there's a sonic dimension as to what comes out of it. The sound actually goes through the space you're playing this in, and the haptic is something that's also another channel of feedback that goes back to our perception. That perception of the sound, of the haptics, is something that we might think of as going through kind of an aesthetic evaluation. Like, is that what I intended? And I think when we feel like we're playing an instrument well, or a passage or a piece of music well, in some ways it might be a case where that aesthetic evaluation, it comes back positive. I mean, like, yeah, I meant to play that and it sounds good, right? And that's when you've perhaps practiced an instrument for years and maybe practiced a particular piece for like 6 months. And when you're playing that, you're not thinking so much about specific like motor movements, or like, I'm going to move this muscle or this finger. You're like thinking about what I want this thing to sound like. And this is all to say that interaction is a loop. We think, we do, we feel, we repeat all of that over and over again. And the other thing is that bodies matter, right? Our bodies are how we attend to the world, how we interact with it. And of course, this is kind of us perhaps acting on the world on the instrument, but this comes with its own feedback dimensions. You might remember these creatures from the book, and this was inspired by O'Sullivan Igoe's physical computing, which they actually had this rendering, which is meant to be the mental model of a user from the point of view of a computer mouse, right? Or at least a computer user interface, and that uses, say, a mouse with a button. And to that interface, to that UI, the user perhaps is little more than really a eye looking at the screen, maybe ears, but just one finger, because that's all you need to click that button. Now, in thinking about this, I went through this thought exercise of like, well, hey, what are mental models of people that play certain instruments? Like, what is the piano's mental model of a pianist, right? We got hands, we got fingers, we got wrists, we got arms, we have one foot, perhaps for the pedals. The eye is important, but really the ears are really what's important. Here's a flute's mental model of a flautist. Here's a cello's mental model of a cellist, violinist. A drum set's mental model of a drummer. This one I kind of just more focused on the more Spinal Tap-esque view of drummers, which is that they tend to get hurt a lot. And then this final rendering, I drew this up as a kind of a thought experiment of thinking about, well, what would be like a fully expressed interface mental model of a human? Something that sees us as for more of who we are and what we're capable of. That includes, eye, ears, mouth, hands, feet, but also brain and heart, however you choose to interpret that, right? Our heads, eyes, mouth, lips, breath, voice. All of these are, I think, might be interesting starting points to think about design of instruments, and indeed over the history, even the more modern history of interface and instrument design, we've seen so many things. For example, here's the theremin, which of course is an instrument that you can play without physically touching the instrument. It uses capacitive sensing to sense the locations, the distances of your hands to these two antennae. Similarly, the radio baton we see here, Max Matthews wielding this, works by a transmitter that's actually two transmitters at the ends of these batons that's getting picked up by antenna on the base plate. And the kind of this information can be used to triangulate the location in 3D of the tips of these batons. And this can be used from everything from kind of virtual conducting to percussion. And researchers in NIME have done this from Max to Andy Schloss. And yeah, there's a rich history actually with the radio baton and the radio drum. Here's Michelle Weichwich with the hands, which is a very nuanced instrument based on kind of our fingers and our arm movement, and really indeed the whole body. This, I think, gives a new meaning to the term digital instrument. Here's Atal and Ben and the BioMuse, which is really exploring this idea of using, kind of our bio signatures as input, as a kind of expressive input into creating instruments, everything from muscle tension to skin conductance. We saw Perry's coffee mug back in week 2. We saw N. Hagee's The Rope in week 4 in talking about the laptop orchestra opera. This is a shared and very physical instrument that people have to play together. And speaking of playing together, here's an earlier instrument. This is Ajay Kapoor and me back at Princeton, and with the E-Dolak, which is a 2-person drum. There's Ajay and there's me. In this case, I'm kind of a electronic spoon player. And we're actually going to have Ajay on the show not too long from now and talk about musical robots. He's done a lot in including building a musical army of robots who play music together, and it's It's quite a sight and sound to experience. Speaking of robots, here's Eric Singer and the Lemur Guitar Bot to the Mouthicizer. This is a camera that's mounted that's actually tracking the shape, the contour of the mouth. And this is used to control everything from effects. For example, you can mouth a wah to kind of get a wah-wah pedal effect for the guitar you're playing, but you can certainly also be adapted to any other kinds of applications. Here's a two-person flute called a tuka, and various things based on things like the Leap Motion. Again, contactless interfaces used in physical reality as well as in virtual realities. Here's Raman, and augmented mobile instruments, in which has kind of these 3D augments, 3D printed augments that you place on your phone. In this case, the phone is generating a signal. It's being kind of channeled through this augment into his mouth, and using his vocal cavity, he's shaping the sound. To instruments based on traditional string instruments, from Curtis Bond's sensor bass to Chris Chaffe's cello, to Tomei Han's Pika Pika. Now, this is such an interesting instrument, and I think it better to ask the critical question: in what ways is this an instrument? For this is something that is really just infused into her body. I have a short video here that we're going to watch, and hopefully the audio will come out okay. I'm going to fast forward here a bit. So that's Pika Pika, right? And the way this works is that she has all kinds of sensors, buttons, bend sensors, accelerometers, that she's wearing on her person. The sensor information is collected on a microcontroller that's that's actually radio transmitted to a nearby laptop, running perhaps one of the most complex Max MSP patches I've ever seen. That often Curtis Bond is operating. What that patch is synthesizing, the sound is actually getting beamed back to her, and the sound is actually coming out of speakers also mounted on her person. Like, she has speakers near her elbows, and she can orient and point in different directions, and she's actually wearing a power amplifier to actually power the speakers. So this is a kind of a very highly embodied way to think about the instrument, in which that cannot be separated quite from the body. So I guess the question here is that, well, first we probably could ask, like, is this a musical instrument? And it may depend on how you define a musical instrument. But within that, if we think this is a musical instrument, where does the instrument begin, or where does the instrument end and the player begin? And is it even meaningful to ask that question? So this continues to be just a fascinating example of how we can think about musical instrument design that incorporates the body. Here's Jaap Blanc in a system built by Golan Levin and his collaborators. Right. So is this a musical instrument? I mean, if you think about how this works, right? He has a head-mounted microphone that's picking up his voice and all the wondrous things that Yop can do with his voice. There's also a computer vision system that's tracking his contour and its location kind of in this performance space, and is doing that, but also projecting kind of this computer animation that's in real time rendered on the screen with him as part of that visual experience. And as he's making these sounds, right, these little sound bubbles, they actually contain like grains of his sound as he's making them. So when you saw all these balls fall from the top to the bottom and hit the ground, we heard this cacophony of sound that's actually just the mixture of the sounds that he's made and kind of encased into these little sound droplets. So certainly it's experiential, but does it even meaningful to ask, is this a musical instrument? But we can certainly think about, to what extent is this expressive and musical, right? A few more examples, just things that also, if you're not familiar, you should totally check these people out. Here's Rebecca. She'd totally be on Artful Design TV, if not for childcare and time zone difference. She's in London. She is perhaps the world expert at the intersection of machine learning, HCI, and music. And she, among many other things, she's created a system called Wekinator, which is a kind of a instrument designed by example kind of a system. And it does a lot more than that, but you can use this to kind of, by example, train a system iteratively to actually behave a certain way. And if you don't like the way it actually works, you can give them more training data and more examples. And so this is such an interesting way to incorporate artificial intelligence and machine learning, in particular in this case, to help us design instruments that are also very human. And so, in my mind, I always hear Rebecca saying, "Don't forget the human in the loop." And we were grad students together back at Princeton, and we played a lot of music together. And we actually wrote a paper together that says, titled "Don't Forget the Laptop." In particular, don't forget the physical laptop. For example, here's Juno in LOLOL, which is laugh out loud on laptop. And this is part of her research into laughter synthesis, but also how we perceive machine-generated laughter.
Adding shape to the note. Adding some noise. More noise.
And of course,
shape to the vowel sound.
check this out.
Inhale by using shift. Or inhale by just jumping to a higher note. And change of the glottal source waveform.
So in a way, she's kind of built a very playable interface that you can do expressive things with. For example, right? So I think part of this research was not necessarily trying to synthesize very convincing laughter with the machine, but specifically using machine-generated laughter synthesized in real time. She was curious as to whether people can identify the affect associated. For example, like an evil laugh, right? Can we get that evil laugh across, even if people are like, well, that's not a real person laughing, but that sounds like an evil laugh. And to the extent that this particular interface can allow her or someone else to learn to do that on a laptop keyboard, I think is quite interesting also in itself. We saw other forms of very physical designs of instruments based on very commodity computers and computing devices. For example, the ocarina and kind of, the successor of ocarina, or at least a spiritual successor. And this is the laptop accordion, which I believe we referred to before on Artful Design TV, but we haven't really seen in action. And so here it is. Okay, so yeah, how does that work? Well, as some of you may know or guess, this actually works by using the front side camera on the laptop and using a computer vision algorithm called optical flow to track how much it's moving. And that amount of movement is used to basically articulate the sound, which is generated on the laptop. Like the ocarina, this is an interface that, well, nobody asked for, right? No one's like, we need a laptop accordion, people. No, but it is. So I guess it's in the category of unnecessary musical inventions. But then again, I don't know. I mean, there's something to it at the same time. And this literally turns this device that most of us use kind of on a daily basis, literally on its side, and turn it into a very physical instrument. I do believe that this is probably very bad for the hinge on your laptop, but so it goes. So with this, I think we're trying to, build up at least this view of musical instrument design and think about the role of the body, as Doa articulated in the beginning, and to think about how important things like body and movement are in the design of instruments. So how do we think about this? So before we get to the specific case studies of what Doa has done, let's think about this question. What goes into the design of new instruments? For example, in a traditional instrument design context, for example, the ukulele or any, let's say, plucked or bowed string instruments, there's the interface, right? There's a fretboard, there's kind of the place where you pluck the string, there's a bridge, the neck, etc. And this is all to support a kind of identifiable sound production. In this case, it's a vibrating string. And so this is really a good example of form. That's how the instrument looks, works, exists in the world, really following the function. And this, if it's going to actually produce sound with vibrating strings, it's going to have something that's going to afford that sort of a interaction in sound making. So this is a form of mutualization. It's worth noting that with computers, an interface, which can be, for example, your mouse, your trackpad on your laptop, can be, decoupled from the sound that it's going to make. And the decoupling happens because there is this very clear middle part, what we might call mapping, that maps what input goes to what output, right? And it's okay, if you press this, then that sound shall occur, or moving lengthwise, moving left to right on the trackpad, it's going to change, say, the frequency of what is being generated. So in this sense, we kind of have this option of decoupling form from function in the design of, say, computer-based musical instruments. I think a good question here is this kind of demutualization, in what ways is it beneficial, but also in what ways is it not? For example, we might think of then having this, I think in one way it's beneficial is that it identifies the kind of instrument into its input, a mapping, and also the output as kind of three related but possibly compartmentalizable parts of the instrument. And in a way, it's tempting to say, well, I think to design a computer music instrument, we'd be done. But perhaps not, right? And then here comes, I guess, the other side of trying to kind of distill this into these three separate compartments of input, mapping, output. And what this is actually is a form of a very kind of feed-forward model, meaning that it's a one-way street. There's input. That input in the form of sensor data gets conditioned. The signal gets cleaned up and prepared for processing that goes into logic, for example, the code that you write. And in that specifying how the input are translated into kind of parameter values going to control kind of a synthesizer that's in the output. Now, this certainly simplifies the way we might think about how to design an instrument, say with a computer. But as Perry very cogently argued, that this isn't always a magic bullet to instrument design, because along with this are potential things that we actually might miss. For example, in doing this, we might actually achieve a kind of a lack of haptic feedback from controller to player, right? There might be a lack of fidelity in connecting in this. Moreover, there's kind of this lack of any sense that sound actually comes from the instrument itself. In short, I think Perry, for me, is arguing that there's a certain, it's easy to disembody kind of this instrument from ourselves, from our body, and to think of it as a thing that's part of us when we're playing it, as opposed to like a thing outside. And going back to kind of how we started this segment, well, I think the feed-forward model, perhaps if it's missing anything, it's actually missing this very important feedback dimension of interaction. Is actually how feel, how sound, and all of these different cues actually contribute to how we think about the instrument, how we play the instrument, and how we think about playing the instrument. And in a way, this is echoed in the world of interaction design. This is one of the iconic drawings of Bill Verplank, right? And who think about interaction design, by the way, that's a term that could be traced back in its usage to Bill himself. Interaction design is really thinking about this cycle of doing, of how we feel about that doing, and what does that tell us about the world? That's the knowing, right? And this do, feel, know, or do, feel, think. And you can see a lot of this embodied also in Perry's work and also in his principles, which in the new interfaces for musical expression community remains kind of the 10 commandments, if you will. And they're actually not commandments, as like really useful ways of thinking. And these are not prescriptions of like how you should design any particular instrument, but these offer like a really valuable lens, a picture of the world, if you will, proposition of how you might go about thinking about any particular instrument design. And before we then go to Doa and the instruments she's designed, there's one thing that Perry has said to me that's echoed with me ever since, and it's kind of what Perry said about what is hard and gnarly about instrument design. And Perry's noted that there are many who view that perhaps mapping is the really gnarly part of instrument design, and indeed that's a really important part. But Perry says that he believes that maybe the really hard part is having the courage to design something and then to use that new instrument, to make music and for people, like in a real world context, daring to step in front of people and actually make something expressive with it. And in a way, that's, for me, completes a feedback loop of thinking about, well, is the instrument actually good? Because in doing that, it's a test of, well, can you make interesting music with it in a more holistic but ultimately experiential kind of a way? So with this, we're going to go back to Doa and look at these, for me, wondrous musical inventions that she has created, and it's part of her research. So Doa, let's see, How are you doing? I'm going to share the screen, and maybe what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce the three instruments we're going to talk about. But then, you know, I have a set of questions for you. And also, please, everyone, if you have questions for Doa or about any of this, please put it into chat. And we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. So the first instrument we're going to look at is a thing that Doa has created called the body harp. Now, I'm going to read just a little bit about it so you get a sense of what that is. So the body harp is a wearable string instrument, simultaneously realizing two ways of thinking about the instrument: as an object that the body acts on, as an extension of the body. The hybridization reframes how an instrument could be played. The performer's arm physically transforms the body into a part of the instrument, as one arm controls the length of the strings, while the other hand plucks the strings. In this unison, the instrument cannot be considered complete without its performer. Right. So, Doa, well, first question is why did you design this? What were you thinking?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I was finding it challenging to navigate between the area where you have an instrument and you play the instrument, and on the other side, your whole body is like kind of consider that as a full body sonification, or just dance without any sound output. And I wanted to design an instrument where I could keep elements from both areas. Like one is like you have actually an interface, a musical interface that you can apply some of the familiar musical interactions. So in this instrument, it's more like plugging, or you can't maybe see it right now, but it has a exoskeleton inside it with flex sensors, so you can actually do some like nuanced finger interaction. So I want to keep those elements. I also have the opportunity to use the space more freely, so to move, and I have some arm gestures when you play this instrument, and they're not very directly mapped by gesture, but it kind of allows you to improvise with the quality of the movement, actually. So that was my motivation.
So I can say as an audience viewing this, right, there's no mistaking of the kind of what goes into playing this, because you're literally moving your arm in a dance like kind of a way, and you're plucking. So there's nothing hidden. But I guess here's a question: how does it feel to play the instrument? You know, what does that feel like?
I think it changes based on the performance, the context. So the composition becomes part of the instrument, but also it has its limitations too, because when you can move, it limits your movement as well, because you're attached to something physical. So I think you kind of like learn navigating between like you're playing an instrument, you're static, but you're also moving. So I think that's the combination of two things.
So here we have just a short snippet of a performance. This is recorded outside, so we actually can't, I don't think we can hear the body harp as well in here, but what we can do is actually see the movement and the kinds of movement that is happening. So I'm going to go ahead and roll this tape. So it seems like this is something that can be adapted to a lot of different kind of performance contexts. And as you said, it seems like there's not a single way to play this or a single sound, because you could vary this up from piece to piece, from performance to performance, and it really depends on the piece and the context.
Yeah, sorry.
Go ahead.
Bonnie is here too, so if she wants to jump in, I think she should. This was her piece, and it was a retelling of a narcissist's story, and so it was interesting because it was a performance with the dancers. There was a lot of improvisation and the music side and the dance side too, and it kind of, I think the important take of for me at least was that I was able to follow sometimes the musicians and sometimes the dancers, and that kind of matched my movement with theirs. So that was an interesting addition. Yeah.
Yes. If in, please do feel free to weigh in, and we can make you co-host on that if it's easier. So Bonnie.
Yeah, I just wanted to say the dancers really appreciated Doa's rhythm. I think that lent a lot to the piece. And the audience members, I got a lot of comments on the novelty of the instrument. And I myself really enjoyed watching Doa. I felt like she was one of the dancers.
So, I mean, this really is a kind of a hybrid instrument in the sense that there's a fine kind of motor movements that we more associate with, like, for example, a musical instrument, with body gestures that we typically more associate with dance. And somehow they kind of meld into one another in the body harp. Thank you very much, and we're going to put links to all of this in the archive after this, so people can check out both the performance, the piece, as well as there's actually at least one paper on the body harp. Thank you, Bonnie. And so Doa, from there, you went on to design kind of physical laptop instruments, specifically for the laptop orchestra. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, I think designing instruments for the laptop orchestra is a little different because it's very fast paced and you need to kind of fulfill all these like elements in the loop. Like you need to design the instrument, then you're responsible for composing a piece for the instrument. You have co-performers that you need to first need to learn your instrument and then teach it to the performers, and actually perform it with an audience. So I think it's a special case where you need to actually fulfill all these elements, and it helped me actually designing other instruments too, because not necessarily we perform or we make pieces for instruments that we design, and it was I find it a useful guideline when I design instruments.
Indeed, and if we're to invoke actually one of Perry's principles is make a piece and not an instrument. And in a way, that principle fits so well with the laptop orchestra in that we are usually not designing like super general purpose instruments, but rather very specific instruments designed to realize a particular piece of music and to do that as well as possible. So it's something that I think really fits kind of this rapid prototyping mindset, but also perhaps something of the medium of computer music is done in a kind of laptop orchestra. And then also, I guess, to Perry's point about having the courage to go perform it in front of people, certainly, like that's knowing that it's like we have a concert coming up in like 2 weeks or 3 weeks. You gotta work backwards from that moment to be like, what do I want this piece to sound like? How's it supposed to feel, right? And you design backwards from that experience. So in particular, I think the first thing to look at, I believe, is the arm top. Is that right? Tell us about the arm top.
Arm top is a funny name, and I don't think it's the best name for it. But yeah, like we use the game track controllers and the laptop orchestra, and it is a very expressive controller by itself. But we want to keep the same idea of having larger scale gestures that can be more expressive and map it to musical articulations or expressive features. And on the other hand, kind of leverage the way we use the musical interactions. And I know not maybe it doesn't seem very similar, but like we both are piano players and we felt very comfortable using the trackpad and dividing into keys. And it was a very versatile interaction. It was fast, and I think, yeah, it helped us to kind of control, invoke the notes, and then with the arm gestures add the nuances.
So this is an instrument, as you mentioned, that's co-designed with Juan Sierra, right? And in this series of pieces that you guys crafted, and right, I mean, I think what you have here seems to be these, again, a melding of two kinds of things. One are finer gestures, and in this case, I think, as you said, you are selecting, for example, the pitch to play, but if you're going to start a note and be like, that's the pitch, maybe that's the timbre, your other arm marked by 2 here is you're kind of almost, well, physically offering that and articulating that and expressing that note in performance, right? So actually, we have a video here. Shall I go ahead and roll this? Anything else you want to say before I do that?
I think we can see the video first.
Right, let's do it. Right. So tell us a bit more about what we saw there.
Sorry. So this is, we want to keep the kind of the traditional roles of the orchestra, or like an ensemble. So Juan there was the conductor. So it was, and then later in the other piece, he actually used a trackpad to capture some of the conducting gestures. And I was playing the arm top as a soloist, and we had performers, further performers there. Yeah.
And well, I mean, when you're performing this, well, I can't help but feel that, I mean, that you're like, what I'm hearing from the arm top is very much embodied in your arm. And in a way, the gesture you make is almost like an offering of each note. And kind of the movement you make with the arm actually, in a way, is so closely echoes and really, for me, it embodies the sound, right? So in a way, your arm is kind of a physical, corporeal, like a manifestation of that, of each note that you're playing. And there's something very, I don't know, almost haunting about that, right? This is and so this is a mostly monophonic instrument, meaning that you can't play chords on it, but you can really like take each note and mold it and shape it over time. So, and then I believe you also have things like the blow top. Tell us about the blow top.
Yeah, blow top. We designed this instrument just for, we wanted to design a flute, a laptop flute, and we managed to hack the how to access microphone and the trackpad, and then it kind of like the interface itself we could imitate the interactions of flute playing, and I think that was the powerful part. And the mapping kind of follow, like you blow to a flute, and then you actually get the same sound producing gesture from the laptop. And then like by like tilting the laptop up and down, like you were able to add vibrato and make some gain changes, and the same trackpad and finger interaction was used to like play the notes and select the pitches. Yeah.
And well, in a way, I think the way you would play the blow top is actually somewhat dependent on the specific make of the laptop. Namely, like where the microphone is actually located on the physical laptop, which is not quite all the same, right? Like on a phone, it's like it's probably the bottom where your mouth is going to be as you hold up the phone to your ear. But in this case, you're blowing into the side of the laptop, and that, at least for these laptops, that happens to be where the tiny hole that is the microphone actually is located on these laptops. I will say it is quite a sight to behold to watch an ensemble of people, quite a few more than two, or at least a section in an orchestra, actually hold up their laptops and blow into it. And there's actually, I believe there's a video of that as well. Our last example is something that's even yet a very different take on the body and in a shared kind of a musical experience. I'm going to read just a description of this, and then we're going to listen to a snippet of it. Felt sound, based on American Sign Language (ASL) gestures and using high amplitude, low frequency sounds that can be literally felt through the body, represents yet another way of considering the body as instrument. Felt sounds performance creates a physical sensations that is as equally felt as it is heard, representing the body as a listening tool. This wearable interface encloses embedded sensors on the fingers and hands to capture sign language gestures. And the sensors are embedded during the 3D printing manufacturing. And artistically, felt sound aims to offer a kind of shared performance context for both deaf and hard of hearing audience members, as well as those who are not. By challenging the idea of music as a solely auditory experience, Doga is driven to craft more inclusive music performance practices. So that is felt sound. Tell us, Doga, a bit more about kind of this idea of felt sound and this shared musical experience.
Yeah. I think it's been 3 years. 3 years ago, Dana Murphy actually had a performance where she used the sign gestures and low frequency vibrations. So that was our inspiration. We want to iterate that work. Mainly want to explore the physicality of the sound, not through like a localized vibratactile feedback, but actually more immersive and in-ear vibrations. And I've been trying to incorporate gestures from, like I said earlier, like either non-musical domains or musical domains that when you have gestures that doesn't really contribute to the sound, and try to use those gestures as a sound generating, sound producing interaction. So ASL gestures are very expressive because they have a very clear functionality and meaning. Although we didn't follow the same narrative, it is kind of like a poetry, and we use the metaphors of those birds. And it was interesting to design an instrument based on the ASL gestures. And it matched well with the sound design to offer musical experience that is just not delivering musical features and information to the deaf and hard of hearing individuals, but kind of offering more of an equal musical experience, not just auditory, so you can actually feel the sound waves. Yeah, that was our motivation.
There's something just profoundly poetic about this shared musical experience, right? I mean, it's I think that the knowledge like that we're sharing the context, and in this case, I mean, it's felt. That's the context. Is that, when you listen to this piece or performance of this piece, this is not a piece you can listen to actually through your headphones. So it wouldn't make sense. You would be in a room, and ideally with one or perhaps many subwoofers, and they're cranked up high, right? And it's those who are not hard of hearing can hear the subwoofer, but everyone in the room can feel it. And you know that everyone in the room can feel it. And I think that knowledge that others that are co-present actually can feel this is a function of what the performer is doing. Really, there's something just incredibly musical about that and poignant about that. So let's go to a clip of this. And again, this is, unless you're listening to Artful Design TV on like large subwoofers, and you really won't be able to feel the sound, but this is kind of give you a sense of the gestures that Doa is making when performing. So this is just a brief excerpt from a performance. So, Doa, I mean, when you last performed this in the listening room at Karma, you did I believe, an exit survey, right? And these are some of the things that people reported as to kind of how they felt. And I'm just going to put it up here so we can all see this. I'm just going to read the first one. It's like, I felt like I was using my torso to listen to music rather than my ears. And the vibration seemed to be felt in and out of the torso, right? And so, in a way, I feel like what you've done here, Doa, with felt sound is to kind of reframe this question of musical performance, musical instrument design, who it's for. And in a way, there have been interfaces designed for the hard of hearing, but this seems to be on a different approach entirely, right? This is a shared experience, and it's something that, I don't know, for me, I don't know what the right word is, but it equalizes, it binds, and it brings together kind of this sense of togetherness, right? So I think with this, anything you want to say about felt sound before we open up for questions? And we are a bit after the hour, so I know some of you have to go for other meetings and obligations, or Zoom fatigue, as always, is a real thing. For those who would like to, I think we're going to stay and at least for a few more minutes to talk about, if you have any questions for Doa, and to talk about instrument design as well as these particular instruments that she has crafted. Doa, anything else you want to say before we open for questions?
Yeah, I think there are two things that I want to say about felt sound. One of them is the limitation of reaching out to the deaf and hard of hearing community. I ended up exchanging feedbacks and collaborating with some of the individuals, but it was really hard to have them in the performance. So I think the performance and the interface might change a lot, and should change probably with a more collaborative design approach. But the other one is, I think one of the comments the audience members said was how she felt light and free in those moments where there was silence, and how it was more active. And it's interesting because it's there are Laban or other movement notation researchers. They do look into how to express expressivity of the moment and qualities, and they were coming from dance and expressive movements, and it's very interesting to actually see that the music can deliver some of those, how the fluidity, maybe it's not just music, but it's also the kinesthetic sense it's communicating. So yeah, I just want to add that.
Thank you. And thank you for also creating these instruments and helping us to reframe what it means to actually design these instruments. We do have some questions on chat. So Doa, could you talk about hardware and software? What did you use to create this instrument? I'm not sure exactly which particular instrument, but maybe you can. So Yash, which one in particular are you referring to, or any of them? Well, for example, in felt sound, what did you use?
Yeah, let me think. I think in all of those I used Chuck and combination of Faust and Chuck. And in terms of hardware, we use Tinsies. Tinsy is a very easy to use with audio. So I use Tinsy, and I think the hardware design, the physical interface changes a lot. In felt sound, I tried a new. It's all 3D printed, but I also tried to embed some of the electronic parts during the 3D printing process to just create small modules that can be easily variable. And how in the felt sound, I had to kind of combine different sensors so that I can get, I can detect some of the gestures. So that gestural composition can change because of those small modules that you can combine in different ways. So that was a highlight of hardware and felt sound.
And here's a question I think that is for like every instrument designer. What was the hardest part, and when do you know you've reached the satisfaction point where you can stop when it comes to music and interaction? That is a $1 million question if I've ever seen one. Like, how do we know when we're done? How do you think about this?
I think you stop when you need to stop. Like
when the concert is happening.
Concert is happening, yeah. The hardest part for me is deadlines. The hardest part is for me, you start by designing and imagining either a performance or an interaction, and the detection part becomes a limitation. And I think that's the hardest part. Like I had to use, like in felt sound, I used 4 or 5 ASL birds, and it was still hard to kind of imitate those words with all these cables and the hardware on my hands. And yeah, I think like the detection system becomes a tricky part to
I think that's right, and I think I see a lot of agreements on chat from from people that have gone also through this process of showtime. It's like if you know the concert is in a week, that's all you got, and at some point I think it's hard to transition from building to really working on the musical content that you're going to perform, and this remains, I think, an intriguing and open question. Maybe we'll take one more, and I think it was actually from Bonnie. What are your plans for version 2 of the body harp? What's next?
Yeah, version 2 is gonna be a collaboration with Bonnie, actually. I already have the trackpad. So the interface of the body harp is trackpad. The game tracks that we use. I took those apart and used their pulley and the string system. So I had game tracks sitting in the Max Lab once we're allowed to go back in. That's gonna be my next step, and we've been discussing how to use those. And I think what I imagine is mostly a physical theater performance or mime, where we can explore other gestural domains, but also kind of combine it with some dance-like gestures and music.
Thank you, Toa. And I was going to end on that question, but here's one more. Because it's a really good one, and it's one that for us to think about. Who do you see as your primary influences? I see a lot of Letitia Tsunami and Pamela Z in these instrument and work. Who else would you include as someone that you feel influenced you in your work?
Well, when I started designing body harp, it was my second quarter at Karma. It was a class project, and I wasn't actually informed about Sonami's work, and a lot of things came like after I designed the instrument. Looking back, lately I'm actually more inspired from composers and from choreographers' work, like Merce Cunningham, and how they approach the music and sound. Yeah, and Pina, she was a great choreographer. So I think like I'm trying to look into more into dance literature lately to kind of reflect, yeah, how they approach their movement gestures.
Fantastic. Well, Doa, it's so good to have you on Artful Design Television. Thank you for being a part of this today, but also thanks once again for all the work that you do. Look forward to more of it. And it seems like movement was a topic of the day. So I think it's fitting that we end today's broadcast back with our dance. We're going to go back into our gallery view, and once more, we're going to let Numa Numa take it away. All right, everybody, you know what to do. All right. Thank you all very much for being part of Artful Design TV. Take good care of yourselves. Stay safe, stay healthy, stay artful. We will see you next week. Take care.